The first major approach to psychology was Sigmund Freud's theory of psychoanalysis. But despite its popularity, there were some major problems with psychoanalysis. It lacked a lot of evidence to support its claims. It just wasn't good science. So psychologists struggled to find a new way to study the mind on something they could observe, something they could measure, something like behavior. The beginnings of what would later become behaviorism started with one man, Ivan Pavlov, and his discovery of classical conditioning. Hard to understand? No. It's simply psychology. Today on Simply Psychology, classical conditioning. Classical conditioning is defined as the basic learning process that involves repeatedly pairing a neutral stimulus with a response-producing stimulus until the neutral stimulus elicits the same response. But first, let's take a look at the history of classical conditioning. It all starts in the late 1800s with a Russian professor and researcher named Ivan Pavlov. An MD, Pavlov was interested in studying digestion rather than psychology, and his research in the digestive process earned him a Nobel Prize in 1904. But it was his research on dog salivation that Pavlov discovered something interesting. Pavlov began noticing that whenever an experimenter was in the room, the canine subject would start drooling like it did when it was given food. Pavlov concluded that the dog associated an experimenter with food, and so it would begin salivating. He called these responses conditional because they depended on a main source, such as the sight of food. Interestingly, researchers at the time didn't pay much attention to Pavlov's psychological discovery, and even Pavlov himself didn't put much attention into it. However, his research helped pave the way for a new field of psychology. Pavlov gave meat powder to the dogs he was studying in order to see how their gastric fluids reacted. The meat powder is what is called an unconditioned stimulus, and the increase in saliva and other digestive fluids is called an unconditioned response. Drooling, when presented with food, is already programmed by nature without the experimenter's influence. The experimenter's presence becomes what is called the conditioned stimulus. Why? Because it is a new variable that the dog is associating with food. The presence of the meat powder in the experimenter creates a new link between the two, so that seeing the experimenter means that meat powder is also present. Now the dog salivates at seeing the experimenter. The increase in saliva now becomes the conditioned response, because it occurs without the need for meat powder or the unconditioned stimulus. A new association is made, and the dog will now automatically salivate at seeing the experimenter. However, there are two conditions that determine the strength of an association, or even if an association will form at all: the law of contiguity and the law of frequency. The law of contiguity means that the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus must be presented at the same time, together, with as little interference as possible. The law of frequency means that the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus must be presented at regular intervals and quite often. These two conditions determine the strength of the association. But what happens when you stop pairing the unconditioned stimulus and the conditioned stimulus, and instead just keep presenting the conditioned stimulus? Eventually, the association loses strength and appears to go away. This is called extinction. But Pavlov discovered that if there was a rest period where neither the unconditioned stimulus or the conditioned stimulus were presented, introducing the conditioned stimulus would bring about a return to the conditioned response. This is called spontaneous recovery. Even though Ivan Pavlov wasn't a psychologist, he stumbled upon what would become a major turning point in psychological study. His discovery helped to push psychology from the focus on introspection and subjectivism and instead on objectivity and measurement. His work helped to give rise to a new paradigm of psychology that focused entirely on behavior, which would later be called behaviorism. Ivan Pavlov's work in digestion earned him a Nobel Prize, and Vladimir Lenin even named him a hero of the Russian Revolution. But psychologists remember him for his accidental discovery that helped the struggling science find its first footing, and continue on to discover new mysteries of the human mind. Hard to understand? No. It's simply psychology. Adios, everybody. Ivan Pavlov's work in digestion earned him enough. No.
So rolling. Ready?
Yeah.
3, 2, 1, action.
Ivan Pavlov's work in digestion earned him a Nobel Prize. And Vladimir Lenin even.
All right. 3, 2,